As communities mobilized to protest racial inequity and violence throughout 2020 and into 2021, businesses small to large vowed to enact change and foster inclusion. Whether through internal DEI initiatives, inclusive marketing, and/or community philanthropy, corporate leaders reaffirmed their commitment to racial equity. We now need to ask ourselves, what has changed and how can progress be sustainable? How do we transform the conversations and aspirations into implementation of meaningful change? By which metrics do we measure success? The urgency of now demands real, sustained change and breakthrough programs and conversation. I'm honored to introduce this next conversation featuring corporate leaders who are rolling up their sleeves and doing the deep work of meaningful change. In this conversation, they will discuss new programs, lessons learned, and best practices for creating meaningful change to drive full equity and inclusion. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our panel conversation today. I'm really excited to get into it, so we're just going to dive in. I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then we are ready for our conversation. So really excited to welcome Tara Hogan-Charles, Senior Director of Racial Equity Programs and Partnerships at Procter & Gamble, to our panel today. Hi, Tara. Thank you for joining. We are also joined by Will Lewis, who is Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Officer at Experian. Will, welcome. Followed by Roldy Leyva, Managing Vice President of Global Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at Capital One and an Out and Equal board member. Hi, Roldy. Welcome. Anna Mock, who is co-founder, president, and chair of the board at Ascend Leadership, which is the largest Pan-Asian business professional membership organization in North America. Pleased to welcome you back to our panels, Anna. And last but certainly not least, Alex Rhodes, Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Global Banking and Markets at Bank of America. Alex, I'm so glad you're on this panel as well. Welcome all of you. Really excited for our conversation, as I said. And just to set the tone for us a little bit, we talked a lot last year during the Workplace Summit about how to sustain racial equity work, like the Black Lives Matters movement, in the workplace beyond the idea of just a moment. It seemed like last May, after the killing of George Floyd, that the national conversation around racial equity appeared to explode. And for some folks, it was the first time that they were grappling with these issues, despite the fact that the movement for racial equity broadly and the Black Lives Matters movement more specifically been organizing for quite some time already. So was this time actually different, or is it more of the same, and why? So we are going to get into it, as I said, in this conversation. And Roldy, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. How is Capital One responding to this particular moment? And I'd also like to know, how are your employees reacting to that response?
All right, thanks a lot, Isabel. And listen, I would be remiss if I didn't first wish everyone a happy summit, and for my fellow Latinos out there, happy Hispanic Heritage Month. So listen, I think the jury is still out on whether or not this time is different. There are certainly a lot of indicators that seem to be signaling that it would be different, certainly as I reflect on the activities of last year. In fact, there was an article put up by the New York Times, I believe, last year that estimated that up to 26 million people participated in demonstrations following the May 25th killing of George Floyd. And if that was true, if those numbers hold, it would end up making it the largest movement in U.S. history. And so I do certainly think that this time does feel different. Now, certainly within Capital One's diversity journey has been a defining moment. I would characterize it as a catalyzing moment for us. It has felt different for us. In the weeks that followed the killing of George Floyd, over 60,000 of our associates from around the world joined one of our several all-associate events that we hosted that were focused on race. This included a town hall discussion on race that we hosted just a few days after May 25th, which itself drew 23,000 associates, inclusive of our CEO and executive committee. And that made that the single largest diversity event in the history of our company. Since then, we've launched an initiative, which we call the CORE Initiative, or Capital One Racial Equity Initiative, which is a set of commitments that have been focused on building equity and inclusion for our Black and Hispanic and Latinx associates and communities. We've more than tripled the size of my team in the past 18 months. We've grown representation on the board of directors. And in fact, among all executives, we've grown Black and Latinx representation by 27% in the past year alone, which is more than in any other time in the past 10 years. We've built new systems, new accountability models to ensure that the progress is systemic, that it is enduring, that is integrated. That includes linking diversity to the compensation factors for our executive committee. It includes a new routine to report out on progress to the board of directors twice a year, and to our CEO and executive committee 4 times a year, and then also sharing progress with all of our associates on a regular basis. So I think this harmonization of awareness, of action, advocacy, and accountability, I think these have been the things that have created what I believe to be an enduring movement for us internally at Capital One.
Thank you for that, Roldy. And I'm really struck by some of the examples that you're sharing. It sounds like Capital One is really invested in looking at systemic changes, right? And that's really one of the challenges I think that all of us face in doing this work. It's making systemic changes in a system that itself might not be equitable. As a society, I think we've not fully come to terms with these realities and sort of grapple with that a little bit. What can we do? How can we leverage the system for change? And so with that, I'd like to bring you in, Tara, and ask you to share a little bit more about your work with Procter & Gamble and what Procter & Gamble is doing in this space. I know that last year, P&G launched the Take on Race Fund with that goal of accelerating and expanding your efforts to again, drive systemic change as well. So curious, how is Procter & Gamble leveraging its power to affect change within a system?
Thanks, Isabel. And it's an honor to be here and a part of this great conversation. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I want to highlight one point you made in the introduction, which is, we're all trying to make progress in a system that is rooted in inequality. A system that in and of itself is not equitable. We only have to look at our history to appreciate the challenges that are facing us. I recently finished a book called 400 Souls, a community history of America, of African American history from 1619 to 2019, and it's edited by Ibram Kendi and Keisha Blaine. And I must say, when I finished that book, I was struck by 2 things. 1, how much of my own history I didn't learn in school. And then 2, how much of our racial equity challenges are not new. We are dealing with problems that have a very long history, that are entrenched in our society in so many ways. And so what I'm optimistic about, though, is our resolve in order to do what's necessary in order to create the equitable society that we all aspire to live in. So to your question, how has P&G leveraged its power to impact change? We've been on the racial equity journey for a while. We started with using our voice back in 2017 to highlight some of the unique challenges Black Americans face here in the US. We launched a short film called The Talk. And for most people, when they hear The Talk, they think, oh, we're going to talk about the birds and the bees. But for Black parents, The Talk is the conversation they have with their children on what it means to be a Black teenager, what it means to be a Black driver, what does it mean to be a young Black teenage boy in a hoodie. The talk for me came when I came home from a school trip in tears because one of my classmates asked if I wanted to get off the bus and pick cotton, which were in the fields on the road along our journey. So highlighting those experiences has been one of the things that we've done to leveraging our significant voice in advertising. We followed up the talk with The Look, The Choice. You can find a lot of these short films on our site, pg.com/widen the screen. So what do these films do? Why is it important to elevate these conversations? Well, we have found that these films, they spark conversations, they lead to understanding, understanding leads to empathy, but empathy leads to action. So we're not just sparking conversation, we're actually taking action. You referenced our Take on Race Fund, which was a fund that we announced along with many other companies on this participating in this panel, but also just around the country on recognizing there's more work to do. We need to accelerate and deepen that work, and we also need to provide the resources to that work. So very proud to be leading some of those efforts across our company, not only with our commitments from an internal diversity standpoint, but also our brands and the roles that they have to reach consumers to elevate some of these issues and challenges. So we are on a journey. I'm very proud of the work that we're doing, but I'm also recognizing there's a lot more work to be done. And so looking forward to continuing to advance the progress that we all want to see.
Thank you for that, Tara. And I echo, for folks who have not seen them, you have to watch these videos. The talk was just, it's a really powerful, powerful short film. So highly recommend. And I think we'll chat in links while we're in the panel as well. Alex, I'd like to bring you in into this question of systemic change. And I'm curious how Bank of America is affecting change internally, but also externally in the community. And sticking with this idea of systems and inequality, as a financial institution, how are you addressing the economic impacts of racial inequity as well?
Thanks, Isabel. And again, great to be with everybody. And it's great to hear the work that this group and many of the people who are listening today are championing. I use the pronouns he and him. When I think about Bank of America and the efforts that we're making, we have a long history. We've been on this journey for a while. This is not a reaction to the events of last summer. It's rather decades of work and commitment that our company has made. I think that allowed us to do a couple of things. One, many of the things already talked about today, bringing together 160,000 employees in a matter of weeks for multiple conversations on race. That helped us, first acknowledge internally the systemic barriers that exist. And I think that's what's so important to this work. It also allowed us to think about it intersectionally. Just as we're in the middle of Hispanic Heritage Month, so many groups that cross over within the LGBTQ+ community are impacted. And I think the acknowledgement as well that, not only are we at a place of a racial reckoning that's been going on for a long time, but we're also in the middle of a health and humanitarian crisis with the global pandemic. And one of the things that we took an initial cut at was a $1 billion commitment over 4 years to racial equality and economic opportunity. That was approved by our board within days of the George Floyd incident, because we knew the work had to be done, and it included external and internal. Looking at our business communities where we can make a difference through grants, we've implemented over $350 million in minority-owned investments into organizations to help them grow. So it's about taking our capital and really being a catalyst, not only in communities, but in small businesses so that they can grow. We've been investing in minority-owned deposit institutions, which you could say are competitor banks to us, but we know how important it is that Black-owned, Hispanic-owned banks have the ability to grow and really thrive in the marketplace. And we want to be a part of that success. Subsequent, thinking about the global pandemic piece, a lot of commitment was made to immediate health needs, both internally and externally. And that has a racial component to it. When you think about what's happened to the Asian community in the last year, a lot of that is directly impacted by the virus and how that has been portrayed by some in politics and in government. That caused us to increase our $1 billion commitment to $1.25 billion and to extend it to 5 years, because we know this is work that does not end today. I think we also have to realize that corporate America is not going to solve. This is not a project management, get out a spreadsheet and solve racial equality and economic opportunity. This is an ongoing journey that I think when we connect with more communities at an intersectional level, but then really back it up with the data and the metrics to show the impact that we're having, that's how we start to, I think, dig out of this and make that forward progress.
Thank you for that. And you brought out a lot of really interesting threads that we're going to get to throughout this conversation. So we're going to come back to those points, but I'd like to bring Will into the conversation now. So Will, congratulations on your new role as Experian's first ever, right? Chief Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging Officer. So curious to know how it's going for you in this new role, what your vision is for creating and sustaining impactful change at Experian, and if there are any tools or strategies that you can share with us that have been successful to leading lasting change here, if there are maybe any tools or strategies that haven't worked that you want to just tell us to drop now. And how you're quantifying these programs. So big question, but just wanting to hear about how you are taking all of this work in your new role in your organization.
Well, thanks so much, Isabel, for having me. I'm thrilled to be here representing the Experian family. My pronouns are he and him. This is work, when we think about what's been happening here at Experian, this is work that's been underway for some time. So it didn't just start when I arrived a year ago. It didn't start with the murder of George Floyd, or frankly, any of the other incidents that's happened, Ahmaud Arbery, what's happened in the Asian American community. But really, it's work that the organization has been after for some time, and we have a lot more to do. Our vantage point and what we're really taking a look at is how do we drive systemic change in addition to the internal work that was mentioned by many of our panelists here today. We are certainly getting after focusing on increasing representation, ensuring that our people inside of our company have an opportunity to grow, talking truth to power, speaking truth to power. So those individuals that may not fall into one of the minority communities, they can't be excluded. They have to be a part of this mission and this journey that we're on. So having really honest, brave, and direct conversations with those individuals. Specifically for us, we recently launched an effort entitled Inclusion Forward. Inclusion Forward is really around how do we help individuals who have been systemically and in some cases omitted from credit inclusion be able to make a mark in credit inclusion for themselves. How do we get them to a point where they understand the power that credit has? What do I mean by that? If you have individuals that are trying to start a small business, most often individuals that are Black and brown put their own personal capital on the line, their house, go to their friends and family to borrow money to start their small business, which is different than a majority. Most cases, the majority can go to a bank, get the collateral that's needed to start their business. Here at Experian, what we've done is we're starting to focus on and create this initiative, Inclusion Forward, which helps educate not only individuals that fall into the minority communities around how they can manage their credit and manage that credit for business, which are two separate things, personal credit versus business credit, how they can manage that to get the capital they need to start their business and to drive and thrive. Also, how do we work with individual consumers along the way so they can understand what their credit means, so they feel empowered when it comes time to buy that first car, when it comes time to buy that first house? And what does it mean? What does the decision mean when you're 18, 19, 20 years old? And how does that impact you when you're 30 years old, when you're trying to make some of these moves in your life? And how do you manage that? And not only by talking to consumers by that, our goal is to talk to other organizations and companies that make lending decisions to help them understand the power of data and also incorporate into their ways of business and talking to these individual consumers to help them. Education is key and power and really critical to help break in the cycle that some folks are in. So when I think about this, I think about systemic change in addition to the things that we're doing right now. And what you'll see, in addition to the initiative I just mentioned that recently launched, there'll be a lot more work around this coming out of Experian in the months and years to come. This is not a sprint, right? This is not a sprint. This is a marathon that we all must continue to stay after. And what's really important to me and to us is that the work we do doesn't just fizzle out as a spotlight shines somewhere else, but instead that it becomes integrated into all that we do. And how do we conduct our business as individuals, as large corporations, and even as small businesses?
Thank you for that, Will. And I think you've sort of nicely summarized a lot of what we're hearing here in terms of the corporate response. I hear, both you and Alex saying this is not a sprint. There's no spreadsheet that we can build, as much as we would like to try, perhaps, right, to address these issues. And I think one of the things that I'm hearing from all of you is a real systemic approach that is holistic, that is looking internally, whether it's through promotion metrics, data analytics at Capital One, whether it is building communities of practice and creating space for your colleagues to get together. I think all of you have sort of shared examples of that, but also Will and Alex, particularly on the financial and economic sort of equity side, right? Really meaningful change to drive shifts in the community, and something that is going to just take some time to build, but will have repercussions for years to come. I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and bring you in, Anna, to talk a little bit about what we are seeing sort of particularly around racial inequity as it relates to Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Beginning this past March, we know that anti-AAPI hate crimes were really at the forefront of our national and really international conversation about race, equity, and the need for change change. I think, Will, to your point, one of the challenges here is when perhaps the media focus, right, or the sort of mainstream focus tends to think there is one action, one community, one moment. And as we know, and Tara, as you shared beautifully in the history that you were sharing, this is centuries in the making, right? So curious to know, Anna, from your side and from your work with Ascend and corporate partners, what meaningful actions have you seen companies take around Asian American and Pacific Islander inclusion, and how do these goals and outcomes measure up against your goals for corporate AAPI inclusion? Have we made it? Do we still have work to do, and if so, where? So I'd love to turn that over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Isabel, and thank you to the Out and Equal team for the invitation to join this conversation. This really isn't our first collaboration together, so I'm thrilled that we continue to do great work together. The 2021 reports of hate crimes against Asian isn't the first time that there's been hate against the Asian and Pacific Islander community. You know, it's actually been going on for hundreds of years since our arrival as immigrants to this country. And as we saw that this first reported spike that Alex referenced really began in February 2020, so really at the beginning of COVID. And the fact that I think, frankly, the community at large didn't recognize that that had been going on for a long time to the API community is indicative of some of the systemic issues that this group has been talking about. So I think first and foremost, I do want to just thank Out and Equal and others who included Asians in this conversation about race. You know, APIs are often, we get lost and forgotten, both in the community, in our companies, as important contributors to American society and to the community. So people often perceive us, and many of you have heard me say this, as white adjacent. So quite often we're not even viewed as people of color, and that's part of the issue. We are of color, so to speak, and we play such an important role in the racial equity and racial equality, and in not only our role that we play, but in the conversation. And I think what's transpired the last couple of years have actually reminded us all of that, right? This sense of Asians being forgotten and invisible, and of us not feeling valued is so deep in many parts of our, in our community. We feel it, right? And perhaps that's a reflection of our own self-confidence, but it's also a reflection of how society treats us. You know, in spite of us being such big contributors to society, and in particular in the workplace, that still happens. So, you know, our stats are, and our contributions are, I would say, undisputed. Where 13% of the professional workforce is comprised of Asian and Pacific Islanders, and in some companies, we're as high as 30 to 40% of the professional workforce. Yet, in spite of all of that, when you look at the corporate ranks of companies, when you look at corporate boards, when you look at the C-suites, we're nowhere near parity, in spite of perhaps a perception that Asians have done very well in our advancement journeys. So that what that means is, you know, organizations like Ascend and our supporters have a lot of work to do, and this collaboration is so critical. I'm so proud again that Out and Equal is one of our largest collaborators, starting with the work that we did last year on our 5-point action agenda that we launched in April in the early days of COVID, where we came together with over 100 companies and started really looking at what a journey together would look like. How do we promote and track a better and more inclusive workplace and society? So that work continues, and working with the companies is one of the important acts. And it's more than just people signing up to an effort, it's us holding each other accountable. You know, I took on this role as Ascend president right at the beginning of COVID, right before COVID in January 2020. You know, even though I've been a co-founder of the organization, and one of the things I realized in the last year and a half or so is really, you know, appreciate and realize what Tara had mentioned earlier about education and the importance of us educating each other and ourselves even though I see myself as a student of race and immerse myself in it when I was in university studying ethnic studies and take pride in having a very diverse network of friends and being relatively learned, I still feel there's so much I have to learn to educate myself. And we have such a long way to go as really just fellow humans, right? To appreciate each other's journeys and the journeys of our colleagues. So that work is very critical because I believe it's not until we can go much deeper in understanding our journeys that we can then start removing some of these barriers that confront us, and that barriers to really preventing us from supporting each other as fellow humans. At Sensei, we've been doing a lot of work on that front. We've been educating our membership, not only of the API experience, but the experience of other groups, and also educating non-Asians and Pacific Islanders of what it means to have an Asian colleague, of what it means to be Asian, so that we can really further that understanding. Some of you have heard me say, have you seen some of my presentations? I very much am a believer that it's really one company or organization at a time, because each organization is at a different place as it relates to what it's doing with its workplace. I like to believe every company is well-intended in terms of what it wants to do to support its workforce, yet there's no question gaps in the company. So we have to really work on one company at a time, influencing one company at a time, and really literally having the really hard and honest conversations about what we are seeing, and being not afraid to put out things that might be provocative, that might make companies and individuals feel uncomfortable, so that we can collectively work through these conversations. That's what Ascend's been doing with our 500 plus companies that are working with us in different ways. But I think as everyone on this call knows, as my fellow panelists knows, it's super hard work. And it's work that's always nuanced, right? It's not just about making statements. And there's this fine balance in doing what I'll call the cosmetic work, which is a bit of that perfuming of doing the work that makes us feel good, from really making sure there's plenty of time set aside and really tenacity to do the deeper work that's going to take years and decades to do. You know, I have a soon-to-be adult child that's graduating from college next summer. So she often asks me, why am I so crazy, right? To do my work at Deloitte and do this work at Ascend and do other community work. And I just tell her, I just feel that's part of my purpose. You know, I'm not going to get this done in my lifetime, but my hope is that I can leave it a better place for those, for her and others that come after me, and that we can create more shared journeys together where we can support each other. For the Asian Pacific Islander community, this has been a really challenging time. And it's challenging for everyone in COVID, but I think it's particularly challenging because most of us really don't want to believe that there's any form of systemic racism, right? Either in society or in our workplaces or in what we experience are really, you know, symptoms of systemic racism. And so we're really still processing what it means, right? Most of us are immigrants, or we're descendants of immigrants. Like myself, I'm a first generation immigrant. I wasn't born in this country. But even those that have been in this country for generations, we're still processing what all this means. Almost all of us came from families, and our parents, either our parents or we came because we wanted this to be a better place, right? America stands for freedom and open access. And so the concept of barriers that are preventing us from reaching our full potential, but preventing people, others, from reaching their full potential, we're still trying to understand what that means and what is our role to try to change that. And at times we even may want to ignore it or believe it's not there or it's very easily solved. So the work is hard. What we are doing is really pushing for companies to not forget us. I mentioned being invisible, and pushing for companies to do the very important work, which is the deep focus and the continued prioritization of doing the work that's very much needed for the Black and Brown communities, but also remember that the Asian communities and other communities equally need attention, but need attention in different ways. So that focus is equally important.
Thank you for that, Anna. And I want to kind of draw on a thread that you're introducing here. And that's the idea of, you're saying there's the sort of corporate work, right? And then the individuals. So those of us who are grappling with what does it mean to be impacted by these systems, to sort of be, to experience inequity in some ways, and as well as folks who maybe don't experience that, maybe struggling with a sense of concern, right? That this is a taking away of something, or that they are in some way responsible. And all of this to say, when we're talking about the corporate responses, when we're talking about the systemic impact, I think we have to keep in mind that ultimately we're talking about human beings. So there are human beings running these systems. There are individuals such as yourselves on this call who are doing this work, right? Who are leading these initiatives, who are moving things forward. And a lot of times the work of equity and inclusion does fall disproportionately to marginalized people and to members of those communities as well. So I'd like to actually start with Alex, but I'd like to open this up to all of you. So I give you a moment here to kind of think about this. How do we ensure that it isn't the case, that it doesn't disproportionately fall to the members of the community that is impacted to do the work of building equity? What does it mean to roll up our sleeves and act in solidarity and allyship across our dimensions of identity? So Alex, I'd like to start with you, but then certainly open it up to the rest of the panel as well.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. I would share, inclusion unites us all. And we really have to look at it that way, that when we talk about inclusion, it is everybody. Our Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer, Cynthia Bowman, likes to say, diversity adds, it never subtracts. But I think that means that we all have a responsibility. And as a white male, corporate America is majority white, 50-50, hopefully male, female. But I think this work is so critical. And what I personally don't want to see happen is leaders support the cause to a point, and then they turn the cause over to those underrepresented communities to really drive the work. And I think that's not the solution. We have to be careful, whether it's through our employee networks, affinity groups, how we organize D&I councils within our organizations, that this isn't a scenario where we don't roll up our sleeves as a majority for underrepresented groups. I see leaders in all sorts of forums, conferences, you'll see it. You get that most senior leader, who is typically white, to come in and introduce a topic, and then they leave the stage. And I think that sends a signal to underrepresented communities of what is that level of support and sustainment. And for our senior leaders out there, or those leaders who are rising in the ranks, it really is, how do you stand shoulder to shoulder with these communities to be able to do this work? My own acknowledgement of the systemic barriers that exist and the majority that has created those, that doesn't mean that I have to not help undo those. My responsibility really is to use my privilege in any community to be an ally and an advocate. I think that's the call to action that we have to make sure it goes beyond. These underrepresented communities need to see our support. And certainly as a member of the LGBTQ+ community, I have some empathy for what that feels like, but I can't walk in the shoes of Tara and her experiences. I don't have that, but I know that the work we can do together will make a difference. I'll add one thing, kind of bring it home to Out and Equal. The bank has been able to fund the Diverse Leadership Initiative that we're kicking off at Summit this year. And that was a really intentional focus to go into underrepresented communities, and then to look at it through the lens of LGBTQ+, to really understand are we building the leaders of tomorrow and giving them opportunities, whether they are talent on campus who may not know if they can come out at work when they start a career in corporate America, or mid-career employees that have never had or been selected for leadership development. That's the kind of work that, if we can use our corporate might to be able to bring that next generation, the demographics are changing. It's telling us, right, that not only the LGBTQ plus community, but in broader sense, these underrepresented communities are not going to be underrepresented in America, at least. And we want to make sure that those leaders are given the opportunity. So I think we all have to join together. It is roll up our sleeves, but while we're still, focused on this work to sustain it, it's all of us. It really is. Inclusion unites us all.
Isabel, I think this is work of consequence, right? And I think where we have opportunity, and I use we broadly, is helping everyone understand that this is work of consequence and what it means for them. When you make something personal to an individual, they then feel inspired. So one of the things that I encourage us all to do is to continue to spend time thinking about not what my personal agenda is, not what I want to get across, but how do I inspire you as a person who's not walking in my lived experience to want to participate, to become active, to engage in a way that's meaningful and drives tangible, sustainable impact over a period of time. I'm fortunate. I'm fortunate because not only can I afford to pay for my home and afford to pay for the lights and things like that, I'm fortunate because I've been able to have access to an education. I'm fortunate that I'm gainfully employed, but I'm also fortunate because over the course of my career, I've worked for and with leaders, senior leaders, CEOs, who have been committed to stepping outside of their space and doing something that's impactful. I think about the CEO of Experian North America, Craig Boundy. He, because of his lived experiences, he's a white man, but because of his lived experiences and exposure to people that are not like him, this is a personal passion of his and something that he wants to ensure that's integrated across our entire environment. So when you talk about how to make impact, he's not that person that says it's someone else's job. Go off and figure it out, and I'll sign a check to do it. We're fortunate he does sign a few checks, but what more importantly, what he does is he tries to figure out how do we integrate this into how we do business. How do we integrate this into making sustainable change in the world? How do we integrate this into what our workforce looks like inside of Experian? And then what role does he play to evangelize this across the board? And when it's really interesting, in every conversation that I have with him, he tells me about another experience that he had with one of our teammates or someone outside of the organization, right? What that tells me about him as a person, and what I would encourage all of us to try and introduce others to, is that he's accessible, right? He's accessible to individuals and people to listen, and then he takes what he hears and converts it to action. So not everyone is at that point in their journey. Some people listen and they hear and they want to, and they don't know how to connect. I think that's for each of us, right? Those of us that are on this panel, those folks that are listening to this conversation right now, is to help connect the dots for the people in our atmosphere that don't understand how to take action. They hear it, they hear what you're saying, but they don't know how to make that next leap to take it to action. Maybe help them. Give them a very tangible example around how they can take action and how they can be an advocate. Let's assume positive intent going in the door. Let's assume that they want to be a part of the change and they just don't know how. So let's tell them how.
Isabel, you mentioned that oftentimes we do find people of color, the ones who are the most impacted by these issues are the ones who are leading the work. I'm a lawyer by training, then I was a lobbyist. I actually really wanted to step into this role because ultimately this is work of consequence, and consequences impact me and my community more than anyone else. So there's nothing like people who have a personal stake in an issue to drive progress. This is incredibly difficult work. If it were easy to solve, we would have solved it by now. If it were a spreadsheet, the spreadsheet would have been made. The systemic change that we need requires systemic interventions and systems that were designed to not do what we want it to do, right? The systems aren't designed to create the equality and the equity that we all want to see. So changing a system is incredibly difficult work. And I think a part of us, I'll speak for myself, is driven by that personal passion. It is wanting to leave P&G and my community in a more equal space than when I started, right? But even if you're not driven by the cause of it's the right thing to do, even if that does not like get you off the sidelines and make you read the books and do the hard work, if that is not compelling enough, then you really should be compelled by the business case, right? So especially if you're in a consumer-facing industry, increasingly consumers want to know, where do companies stand on this issue? I think there is a very vocal and very, I would say, highly publicized minority on some of these issues. But I think for the most part, what we see in our data, what we're hearing from our consumers, is they care about these issues and they want companies to care about these issues. In addition, if you are in the hiring business and you want to attract and attain diverse employees, they're asking these questions in interviews. I mean, our new hires who are looking at our films, who are looking at our commitments, they're watching what we're doing, not just what we're saying. So if you're looking to attract and attain the workforce of the future, these are also places where you need to have systemic action and interventions, and also to show and make progress. So I think that we are, and this is the optimist in me, reaching out and looking for the silver lining, that the ecosystem around us is changing. I do think that there is a lot of reasons to feel like we will, make some of these changes that we so desperately want to see. But I think if you're not compelled by the heartstrings, then your purse string should get you there. So those are the ways I think about it. In my personal capacity, it is being more vulnerable at work, being more willing to share my story about being a Black woman at P&G and also in this country. I was extremely blessed growing up where two parents, middle income household. I was at state board in 4-H. I was a German major in college. I mean, the craziness goes on. But more recently, I've been more willing to talk about what it means to be a Black woman married to a Black man living in Washington, D.C., being nervous that my husband leaves. He's a Duke trained lawyer and engineer, getting in his truck, being just another Black man. So being vulnerable and being willing to share those stories with my colleagues, I wasn't willing to do that before. So I do feel like being more vulnerable, being more accessible, getting our leaders to a place where they feel more vulnerable and accessible is help. And so those are some of the I would say, bright spots in otherwise pretty difficult day-to-day work environment. So
I'd love to build a bit on what Tara just said about being vulnerable. Both through my Ascend work and actually as a partner at Deloitte, I actually have the good fortune and privilege of being able to interact with lots of executives from all races and backgrounds. One of the themes that often comes up, in particular when we start talking about race, is there's a certain degree of loneliness. It's kind of an interesting feeling when you think about, we talk so much, especially now, right, about race, and there's a lot of people that you can converse on the topic on, but there is a degree of loneliness. And I think that loneliness comes about because, especially if you are a person that is from a marginalized community, a person of color, or a person that is from a group that we feel is not completely accepted, you feel like it's all on our shoulders, right? You're not sure, as you are trying to be vulnerable, as you try to make change, that people are hearing you. You're not sure if people are just trying to placate you. You're not sure if you're really making a difference. And so one of the things that I really have asked our members to do, and also as I talk to other executives and colleagues, is to make sure that we recognize that loneliness and the vulnerability that many of us face and experience, and to share, to bring us out and to really change the mindset of how you or others can help a fellow human reach our full potential. right? It's really a shared responsibility. It's for society's benefit if we can all reach our potential, right? If we reduce the number of people who feel marginalized, the number of people who feel lonely, and if we can really collectively help us get to be a more successful place. I often am known to admonish certain or redirect the conversation when I hear people talk about evaluation processes, right? And they say, well, the reason these results are the way they are is that's just how it turned out. Or that, it was the individual that didn't get something right. And I always challenge, I said, true, there is a degree of a person's success that is completely on them. Right? It's completely on them to figure out certain things, to break the ceilings, to learn how to engage and learn how to be successful. But the institution and the system also has a big role in that. And the example I give is many companies hire people direct from college, right? And all of our recruiting processes should be having us hire the best out of whatever, right? Whatever schools, the best talent we can the moment they walk in the door. So why is it that years later, when someone's up for promotion, and by the way, the company was responsible for developing that same college hire, that suddenly certain segments of the workforce didn't do as well for the evaluation processes or the succession processes as others? Who owned that responsibility to create and have that person do as well? I would say the company owns that as well as the individual. And quite often we put all of that burden on the individual and we tell people, you didn't do enough, you didn't do X, you didn't do Y. And I think it's important to really change that conversation to say it's not only the individual's responsibility, but it's the organization's responsibility. It's all of our responsibilities as managers and leaders to help others get to a certain place so that really that person doesn't feel like they have to figure it out on their own, and their successes are shared by others to support them. And so that is one of the big things that I really want our members and encourage our members to focus on as leaders, and also that I heavily evangelize, because until we change that mindset, then we're just trying to fit each other right into boxes. But we have to really start thinking about how we shift that. And it's not about someone fitting into someone else's boxes, but how we all support each other and change what is the field we play in, and to get us to all that place. And it's actually a privilege for all of us to be able to support a fellow human being, to help a fellow colleague, a fellow friend, a fellow human reach their potential. I mean, that's the greatest feeling, right? When we know we can do that.
And that really resonates with me. We talk about that in terms of the loneliness of onlyness, and the need for community to come together to activate change at scale. Something else that you said that really resonated with me, and by the way, I just loved hearing all the insights and perspectives from all of my esteemed colleagues here, was this idea that that we need to share the responsibility, that too often we expect that individuals of the underrepresented group, of the marginalized group, is to carry the burden of this work. I have found, especially in the last 18 months, that the majority group, and in this case, listen, we all identify across a range of identities, and some of them are dominant, some of them are non-dominant identities, but in this context, specifically in the context of race and gender, I found that in the last 18 months in particular, white male leaders or white leaders have felt even more reticent to step into the space of leading against a backdrop of cancel culture and everything else that they see happening, and they're sort of paralyzed to engage. And so they expect even more so that it is that person of color or the woman or the gay person or the transgender individual across any marginalized identity group to teach them, to lead the way. And I would counter with that being as sort of the very definition of privilege, that as a white person, as a member of a dominant identity group, that you would expect the non-dominant member to educate you on their lived experiences and what's happening in the world around you. And so, I've shared with our leaders, and I would expect folks, regardless of how they identify, to know that no one is seeking perfection. I am not looking for someone to fix me or to solve all of my problems or to prescribe a solution on me. What I'm looking for is participation. And so leaders don't get to talk about all of what diversity and belonging means to them, but then suddenly be silent when we expect and we need their participation and their support. And so the last thing that you said that resonated with me is ask, right? Be inquisitive with humility. Ask others how they are feeling, what their lived experience is. That is, to me, the distinction between inclusion and belonging, because inclusion is a choice often made by the person including for the person being included. And already there's a power dynamic there that favors the dominant identity group. But belonging is working backwards from how that other person is living that experience, learning about that experience, and helping to meet them where they are and going on that journey together. And so I find that this idea of seeking to understand and listening and solving for whatever the thing might be together is a faster and more genuine and more sustainable way to belonging than any other method.
I think you've just given the definition of allyship and advocacy, right? It really is both sides and both parts of the community reaching out. And I see allyship and advocacy as a two-way street. We really do have to not only give grace to those that are learning about a community, right, and create that culture of inclusion, but then the belonging sense is that we all really do have to come together and support one another. And the intersectional component that's become, I think, really mainstream, which I'm proud of and happy to see when we see these communities coming together, it is those hearts and minds, sometimes one person at a time, and as you said, one company at a time. But that really is how I think we're going to ultimately build our way out of this, is each of us seeing ourselves as allies and advocates for each other, because we do represent so many different communities and backgrounds that back to that diversity adds, it never subtracts. If we keep including others and keep allowing others to belong, we'll continue to grow on our inclusion journey.
I really want to build on this idea of inclusion and belonging, because I think Rowdy and Alex, you all are really touching on something here, right? Inclusion, when you think about it from a corporate perspective, inclusion is we hired so many of, right? We brought more people into the organization. We made space for them inside of our company. Belonging is when you actually give them a voice at the table and allow and ensure that they are a part of the decision-making process. I want a voice. I want a voice at the table, and so should everyone else from underserved communities. And when we think about LGBT population, Black, Hispanic, people with disabilities, there's an intersectionality that happens there that really kind of crosses over all those items. And I want to talk about the disability population for a second, or population of those people with disabilities, because so often we'll take a look at it and we'll reduce it to a number. We've hired X% of people with disabilities, but have you created an environment where that individual can belong, where they can thrive? Our goal should be to create an environment where everyone can thrive, no matter their differences. And it may be through things like creating software tools or hardware that a person can navigate if they can't see, or if they have an auditory impairment, or if they have dexterity concerns as well as a part of it. Ensuring that our tools and processes does not automatically omit them from the conversation because they can't understand what's happening. Right. And so when we think about this work around equity and equality, I think it's getting to the core, it's getting to the root. And what we do and all that we do is should be creating a space for parity, creating a space where a person can thrive while they bring their whole selves to the table. We often hear about this, bring your whole self to work, which we should do. Right? But if a person brings their whole selves to work, we need to ensure that the workplace can allow them to thrive, all of them as well, and they shouldn't have to change who they are as a person to do it. And I think this idea of intersectionality that we all are talking about, and this difference between inclusion and belonging, they go hand in hand, and I think we need to just continue to do more of that. And the last point I'll make on this is that our accountability partners, the not-for-profit organizations like Ascend, are so, and like Out and Equal, are so critical in ensuring that we stay, that we hold ourselves accountable, right? We want our partners like that to hold us accountable as corporations. We want to ensure that we understand the things that we don't see, the potholes that are ahead of us, and then push us, challenge us as corporations to move forward, and then insist that we as organizations integrate that into our internal accountability structure as well, right? We're doing things like including it as a part of compensation. We're doing things like creating expectations for our senior leaders and our frontline managers around how to do it. We're setting it as a core value. The work that Out and Equal does, the work that Ascend does, the work that many other not-for-profit organizations do are really critical in helping us continue to move forward.
Thank you, Will. And I want to draw on a point that lots of you are bringing up here, and that's around belonging, right? You mentioned, for example, it's easy to be able to say we hired X number of people with disabilities, Y number of people of color, Z number of LGBTQ people, but how do we measure belonging? That seems to be a little bit more of a more nebulous, soft idea that's difficult to measure, or we think of these efforts as nice to have, but they're secondary to whatever the business's bottom line might actually be. So I'd like to ask Roldy, starting with you and open to others who may wish to join in as well, how are you leveraging data and analytics specifically to demonstrate that value, to measure and show that return on investment? So Roldy, I'll start with you. How is Capital One using data and analytics to drive belonging initiatives and again, to demonstrate that impact?
Yeah, so first I'll share with you that I think the work of diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging is in many ways sometimes a foreign language to many people, and certainly to those in the business. And so what you have to do to be able to get this work to stick is to speak in a language, identify the currency that the company trades on, that the leader trades on, and data is often that thing. And also we know that what gets measured gets done. And so we use data to inform our strategy, to bring our leaders and associates along with us on the journey. It helps to engender trust, builds buy-in, and it's also what we use to structure and enable accountability, ultimately ensure that progress is sustainable. We use a number of different tools, right? So we shared, we have data transparency and reporting for all associates. We have dashboards we provide our executive committee and the board, and we measure all sorts of things from representation and the levers of representation to leveraging predictive analytics to looking, which help us get a sense for to what extent are certain groups of our associates likely to attrite in the coming months or years, and then informing our strategies that way. But what I really want to get to is your specific and sort of how you framed up the question, which is around belonging. Because what we haven't done, I think historically as an organization, has been to get really good at defining what it is that drives one's sense of belonging, as much as we've been able to build what we have historically referred to as an inclusion index. And so we measure associate sentiment 3 times a year. We have this inclusion index. We have all sorts of I think, fairly trusted measures around inclusion. But I don't know that anyone's really cracked the code on like what it is that drives a sense of belonging in an organizational context, nuanced by identity group, right? Because my sense of belonging will be different than that of someone else based on their race or their age or generation or gender identity or sexual orientation or fill in the blank. And so we're studying that now. We're building and leveraging a lot of sort of robust and sophisticated analytics to take a look at what are those things and what are those things that are shared by identity group versus what are those things that are unique to an identity group that drive one sense of belonging beyond just inclusion. We know that psychological safety is an example of a common element, but that will be nuanced by individual group. Physical safety, their sense of community and ability to build social networks, their access to development, and the outcomes that those drive. And so we'll have hopefully more to share as we complete our build out and our testing of our hypotheses around these things. But that's just another example of how we continue to kind of innovate around data and analytics, because I think it is important to be able to form the strategies that are needed to move this work forward into the future.
Thank you for that. So I realize that we are coming up on time. So I do have one more question for all of you, actually, and that's a little bit more of a personal question. Again, going back to this idea, I think you shared some really rich examples of systemic impact of changes that you are doing internally, as well as within the community. But coming back to this idea that systems are ultimately run by people and that you all are the ones that are actually doing the work in your organizations, this is a long journey. We've talked about that quite a bit throughout this hour. How do we keep momentum going? And how do we sustain ourselves personally doing this work? So I'd like to ask all of you, and I'll call on you so we can sort of go in order of how folks appear on the screen for me. What advice, by way of closing, what advice would you have for others leading this similar work in their organizations? What do you do to keep yourself empowered and ready to go? Anna, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind. What advice do you have for others that are leading this work? What keeps you going?
What keeps me going is the inspiration, really our colleagues, my colleagues, but also the people like those of the colleagues on the call and who are really doing this work. So I don't feel like it's a solo journey for me. And I know sometimes we get tired, sometimes we wonder if we're making a difference. I would just tell the audience, you have to trust that every act that you are doing to move the needle, whether big or small, is actually going to make a difference. I firmly believe that if we each kind of contribute, right, the pennies to the jar, that jar is going to be so rich and so overflowing that we're going to have so much available for everyone to share. And so keep doing this really hard work that we are doing together, and know that you are not alone in that journey.
Thank you. Tara, what about you? What advice do you have for others leading this work?
What advice do I have? I would say, I'm relatively new to this role at P&G. I started this role in February. And so what brought me to the work is really just recognizing that I have unique skills and contributions that I could lend to the cause, right? So if I would ask, if you're in your company and you look around and you see inequities or you see an opportunity to have a more equitable result or to influence a system for a more equitable result, speak up and engage in that work. And so I feel like I've kind of put my own action to that, so that there was a unique opportunity to bring my skills to bear. I'd be remiss, Isabel, if not to mention being a Black woman, right? And understanding and appreciating that a lot of these inequities are hitting Black women harder in these communities. And to talk about transgender women of color, transgender Black women, even more so. So I'm also fueled by the lack of progress. I'm also fueled by the lack of attention made to, the murdered and missing Indigenous women and Black women and girls in this country vis-a-vis the attention that others get. So there's so many opportunities to continue to highlight the inequities, but also how do we turn that into progress, right? How do we look for those opportunities and those ways to make a difference? And so my advice would be stay engaged, stay in the room, even if the temperature gets hot and it's an uncomfortable conversation. Take your own journey to understand these issues a little bit better if you're not in these marginalized communities, and leverage the vast amount of resources that are available to anyone, no matter where you are on the journey, in order to be better. So that would be my advice. And thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, Tara. Alex, what about you? What's your advice? How do you keep yourself going?
I think it's about practicing radical empathy. As we think about the group that's joining us today, these are the believers. These are the people that understand the priority of this work. And many of people who are joining us today are champions of that work. But we know we have to keep expanding that circle. And sometimes to do that, we have to learn to empathize and understand others that may not have the same understanding that we have about the history and shared and lived experiences that we've had. Until we can continue to expand that circle, back sometimes to one heart and one mind at a time, to bring more people into this work, I think our cause will continue to have these systemic barriers. Those barriers will only come down when we seek to understand perspectives that might not be our own. and being able to practice that radical empathy, I think, is so important. It's what fills me up when I know that there's one more voice, one more parent, one more child, one more person that I didn't know I'd ever agree with, or I thought for sure wouldn't accept me, does. And I think that's how we continue to evolve the allyship and advocacy that's so important to this work.
Radical empathy. I love that. Thank you. Will, what about you? How do you keep the momentum going? How do you sustain?
People. As individuals, we have the power and the authority to make change, to make impact, and continue to learn ourselves individually. I'm a lifelong learner. And for myself, the opportunity that I have to learn from teammates who may not be everyday D&I practitioners, who may be just living their everyday life. Those are the individuals I learn from every day. I actually miss attending Summit in person and being at things in person, because I learned so much from those in-person interactions. Helps me grow as an individual. It helps kind of fill me back up, because we all know there come those ends of the some weeks where you feel like your pot's running low. It was a really trying week because you got caught up in the minutia of everyday life. What I often do when those days come is I take a moment to think about what's our purpose, what's this work of consequence that we're talking about, and then anchor myself to the work of consequence, fill myself back up, and start at it again. Every individual I come in contact with refills my pot just a little bit more. I count on every individual I come in contact with in those interactions to help me continue to flourish.
Love that. People. And last, but certainly not least, Roldy, I'd like to turn to you. What advice do you have for others that are leading this work in their organizations? How are you keeping yourself sustained?
Yeah, it's tough to follow that. +1 on what everyone else said. I would say, listen, stay curious, seek to understand, lead with humility, with heart and humanity. And to quote the great Dr. Janetta Cole, keep the faith and do the work.
Keep the faith and do the work. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. Roldy, Alex, Will, Tara, Anna, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your expertise with us. Thank you everyone for joining our conversation today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your summit. Thank you.